When you look at the venue listed for the 1939 NFL Championship game, you will either see the Dairy Bowl or Wisconsin State Fair Park. And while both of those are technically true, neither really tells you the entire story about where exactly this game was played. That being smack dab in the middle of Milwaukee Mile. That's right, nearly 80 years before the Battle of Bristol, the Green Bay Packers did it first, and with the stakes being far higher than some college football game. I'm Cheyenne Hollis, this is The Touchback, and today it's the story of an NFL championship game played right in the middle of a racetrack. The year is 1939, the Rams are in Cleveland, Pittsburgh still known as the Pirates, and football in America is finding its footing after having finally escaped the shadow of its college counterpart. Attendance is growing and the National Football League is firmly entrenched as part of America's burgeoning sporting culture, even if it's still not the most popular and won't be for some time. The 1938 NFL season ended with the New York Giants upsetting the Green Bay Packers for the title. That game is probably best remembered for the Packers head coach Curly Lambeau getting himself locked out of the stadium at halftime before he could give his team talk. He would be allowed back into the stadium before the start of the second half, but it wasn't enough as the Pack lost to the Giants. This matchup would be run back in 1939, but how did we get there? Let's start with the defending champion, those New York Football Giants. The Eastern Division in 39 was very much a two-horse race between New York and Washington. The teams had tied in a 0-0 barn burner in week 2, and then each one would go on to lose a Western Division road game in the middle of the campaign. As fate would have it, the two teams would square off in the last game of the regular season, which served as sort of a de facto playoff game. Each side was 8-1-1. The winner would move on to the NFL Championship game, and the loser would go home. They would not go home without a fight, though, a literal fight. This game is chaotic scenes. So the Giants are in control for most of the contest. They kick a trio of field goals and they have a 9-0 lead heading into the final frame. Washington scores a touchdown in the fourth quarter to cut the score to 9-7 and then gives themselves a chance to win the game with a field goal in the dying moments. This is where all hell breaks loose. As you can see, it appears that Washington kicks the game-winning field goal. They're going to go on to the NFL Championship game. The spoils are there. They have won 10-7. Only they didn't win. The referee decides that this field goal, which again, it looks pretty good based on the video, is actually missed somewhere, somehow, wide, short, long, I don't even know. As you can imagine, the Washington team is not particularly thrilled and they start wiling out. In fact, it's alleged a player would even go on to punch referee Bill Halloran. This is only half of what's happening though. New York Giants fans after the game are storming the field and desperately trying to bring the goalpost down. This is just absolute chaos. Like, what is going on here? Well, we know what's going on is that the Giants would win this game and clinch a spot in the 1939 NFL Championship game under what can only be described as dubious circumstances. With your Eastern Division champs confirmed, who would they play in that title game? After week 9, the NFL's Western Division was really the Detroit Lions to lose. They had a 6-1 record, which was better than the Packers at 5-2 and Bears at 4-3. As the Lions, though, are wont to do, they would just not. They would choke this away. They lost all of their remaining games and finished in third in the Western Division. Chicago needed to win out and hope they got a little help from Green Bay to leapfrog them in the standings. Chicago took care of their part of the equation, not losing again in 39, but the Packers did likewise, meaning they would be Western Division champs and they would be representing the Western Division in the NFL Championship game. Perhaps the most interesting thing here, though, about the Packers' schedule in 1939 is the balance of it, or namely, there is no balance of it. The team played all of their home games to open the year and then finished with 5 consecutive road fixtures. While it wasn't unusual for Green Bay to load up their early season slate at home, this was only the 3rd time in team history to this moment that they managed to have all of their home games first and then follow that up by playing all of their games on the road. That is something they would also accomplish in 1940. That, though, is months away. We still have a champion to determine. On one side, it's the New York Football Giants, and on the other side, it is the Green Bay Packers, who we know would be hosting this rematch from the previous season. They wouldn't be hosting because of on-field record or anything performance-related, mind you, but simply because it was the Western Division's turn to host the championship game, where Green Bay would opt to hold this historic matchup. Well, that became a hot button topic in Wisconsin. Since 1934, the team had split games between Green Bay and its home of City Stadium and Milwaukee, where it happened to play at Wisconsin State Fair Park. They only played there a couple of times each season. It wasn't like a huge split, but Milwaukee got a few games every season. Now, it must be stated that City Stadium was an actual stadium designed for ball sports. The Wisconsin State Fair Park, well, it was just a field in the middle of a racetrack. Of course, it did have a huge grandstand on one side and could add bleachers around other parts of the track. In order to make it sound like an actual football stadium and not a place for auto racing or where carnival rides might be found, they called it the Dairy Bowl when the Packers were playing there. This was just a name, though. It is very much a racetrack where shoddily organized football games could be played if need be. Anyway, this was the Packers' 3rd appearance in the NFL championship game, but the first time in team history that they were actually going to host the event. Would they choose to stay loyal to the city that was their namesake, the place that they called home, or would they chase dollars in the big city? Come on, this is the NFL we're talking about. Even in the 30s, it was always about the almighty dollar. While Curly Lambeau did weigh the pros and cons of each location, simply put, the extra revenue that came along with hosting the game in Milwaukee was too good to pass up. Not only could they hold more people in the Dairy Bowl than would be possible at City Stadium, but since Milwaukee was a bigger city, it allowed them to charge more per ticket. To that extent, the decision was a rousing success. There's no doubt about that. Some 32,279 people made their way to the Dairy Bowl on this day. The gate, the revenue for the contest was a little more than $83,000, which of course would be split between the teams and the league. Very important money for everyone to have. However, by just about every other metric, this decision was a disaster. For starters, a lot of people in Green Bay were pissed that the team with Green Bay in its name would not be playing the championship game there. By the way, it takes a hell of a lot to piss off Wisconsinites. You'd have to do something like telling them their cheese isn't nearly as good as Tillamook cheese. A quick public service announcement for you though. Tillamook cheese is so much better than cheese from Wisconsin. All of the Tillamook dairy products are better than anything you can find in Wisconsin. Sorry, not sorry. When fans started to fill into the Dairy Bowl or the Milwaukee Mile or Wisconsin State Fair Park, or whatever the hell you want to call this makeshift setup, they didn't exactly enjoy what awaited them. Despite being charged pretty opulent prices by 1939 standards, a lot of the seats either had bad views, were too close to the ground, were in odd places. It was just not a good setup for football if you're charging someone a lot of money. Here's how Milwaukee Journal writer R.G. Lynch describes the entire thing for fans. While fans were out there getting gouged for crummy seats and bad views, players might have even had it worse, as many of them were preparing for what was the biggest game of the season, and for some, the biggest game of their career. They were being forced to change and get ready in a 30-foot square room, just box, I guess, that was dubbed a quote-unquote locker room, but was nothing of the sort. While players were getting packed into a proverbial clown car simply trying to change into their uniforms before the game started, members of the media were up in the press box on the top of the grandstand fearful for their lives because the damn thing wouldn't stop shaking. It was a really windy day, and the gusts meant that the press box and the grandstand were just swaying in the wind. Not a great feeling for anyone. Despite all of this, and with a 50-yard line that was on the Milwaukee Mile's start-finish line, things kicked off as planned and really were mostly forgotten, at least until the final whistle. Things got off to a pretty good start for Green Bay when an Arnie Herbert touchdown pass gave the Packers a 7-0 lead in the first quarter. Not much else would happen in the first half apart from turnovers, and we'll get to that in a little bit. With the score 7-0, the players headed back to their sardine tin excuse of a locker room with everything still to play for. Whatever Curly Lambeau said at halftime worked, or maybe Giants head coach Steve Owen and the team just looked around at a racetrack with a grandstand about to get blown away and stopped caring. Whatever the case may be, the Packers came out like a house of fire in the second half, determined to right the wrong of 1938. The Packers would score 10 points in the third quarter and then follow that up with another 10 points in the fourth quarter to secure a 27-0 victory over the Giants and nab the NFL championship. The game, though, it was really a story of interceptions. The Packers threw 3 interceptions on this day, while the Giants threw a staggering 6 picks. However, that number gets far more interesting when you realize 4 different players threw an interception for New York. I mean, what were they even doing here? Okay, so through the modern lens, this looks weird. It just looks odd that you have 4 different players throwing passes and throwing interceptions, but honestly, it wasn't all that unusual for NFL teams to do in the 1930s. The forward pass still hadn't quite been fully fleshed out as a strategy by some coaches. Of course, the wind obviously didn't help matters either when it came to throwing the football. Who cares how you win as long as you win the championship, though? Packers players, coaches, and fans, they celebrated. And they celebrated despite a pretty crappy venue and everything just being wildly overpriced. 2 issues, by the way, that still exist to this day. So what would happen after the 1939 NFL championship game? Well, these 2 teams would meet again for the title in 1944, this time with the Polo Grounds playing host. The change in venue, though, it did not matter, as the Packers would go on to knock off the Giants yet again. That would really be it for the franchise's first golden age. The next 15 years were not kind. It was pretty brutal there. They didn't get to another championship game. They had a lot of bad seasons for what had been up until that point arguably the most successful team in the National Football League. Eventually, Vince Lombardi would take over as head coach and restored the Packers to their former glory. They did lose the 1960 NFL championship game to the Philadelphia Eagles, but success was right around the corner, and this time it would actually happen in Green Bay. The Packers qualified for the 1961 NFL championship game, and make no mistake, they were playing this thing in Green Bay. That was made possible by the opening of New City Stadium, a venue that would go on to be known as Lambeau Field, a place named after a man who opted to play the franchise's first home NFL championship game in Milwaukee. It all comes together here. The New York Football Giants would once again be their opponents in a championship game, and this time around the scoreline would be even more one-sided, with the Pack winning 37-0. A rematch at Yankee Stadium was on tap for 1962, with Green Bay clinching back-to-back championships as both victories would come over those Giants. As for the Dairy Bowl, or is it Wisconsin State Fair Park? Let's just call it Milwaukee Mile. That's cleaner. The makeshift setup would continue to host Packer games all the way up until 1951. A few years later, in 1954, the track would be paved and has hosted all kinds of auto races and racers over the years, including IndyCar, NASCAR Xfinity Series, and the NASCAR Truck Series, to name a few. From what I can gather, this is the only place on the face of the earth where Curly Lambeau, Mario Andretti, and Kurt Busch have all been victorious. Enjoy that fun fact you probably won't forget, but also will never ever be able to use unless you're like me and you try to awkwardly pigeonhole it into a conversation only to find out no one even cares. Perhaps the biggest shock, the biggest upset of this entire story is the fact that rickety old grandstand where media members were fearful of getting blown away wouldn't be demolished entirely until 2002. Sure, there were changes made over the year, but by and large, this was the same place where the Packers won the 1939 NFL championship game. In fact, that small, crappy room they used as a locker room was still standing when it did eventually get raised for a new grandstand at the Milwaukee Mile. There you have it, the story of the NFL championship game played right in the middle of a racetrack. Thank you for watching this video. If you would like to know about what seeing a Giants game is like during modern times and how it compares to their stadium mate, the New York Jets, well, check out the video in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Until next time, I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.